From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
In this day and age, we think that many people think that the only kind of way of knowing, the only legitimate way of knowing is like nonfiction or data or numbers or facts. But fiction is another way of knowing about the world.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Christopher J. Scalia. He's the author of the new book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read. We'll talk more with Chris a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. R.J. Pestritto. He is Dean of the Graduate School, Professor of Politics, and Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Pestritto, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And most to the point today, he is your teacher for the brand new Hillsdale College online course, The Federalist. You can find it at hillsdale.edu/new course. What would you say to someone who perhaps hasn't read the Federalist Papers since school, or maybe never at all? Why should they explore them now?
Well, if it's just that they haven't read the Federalist Papers since school, then good for them, because they probably had a good school, because it's the case that they're not often even read in school anymore, unfortunately. But what the Federalist does is to address the timeless principles of American government, right? So the Federalist is a book that's made out of a series of papers that were published in the newspapers during the debates about ratification of the Constitution of 1787. And so it goes through the Constitution. It lays out the principles of government. It talks about how the different institutions are supposed to work to achieve those principles. And you could ask, well, why is that very old question still relevant to us? But I think that anyone paying attention to the news at all these days, what do we see other than questions about what our Constitution means? Is President Trump allowed to do this? Is President Trump allowed to do that? We had a major attack on the so-called administrative state, on the federal bureaucracy. Lots of people said, oh, this is contrary to law. This is contrary to our Constitution. This is contrary to democratic principles. Is that really true? Well, what are those principles, and what does the Constitution say? And in fact, one thing you might learn from reading the Federalist in particular is that the president is supposed to control the executive branch, all of it, yes. Hiring and firing and everything else. And so these are just timeless questions and very relevant today as the new initiatives of the new government come before the courts, and especially before the Supreme Court. The arguments of the Federalist and those principles are going to be considered and employed in deciding these cases. I can guarantee that. So.
You emphasize in the course that the Federalist Papers, they're grounded in a realistic view of human nature. Why is that perspective so important for understanding how and why good government works?
Well, what I tell the students is this isn't a philosophy treatise. You're not reading Aristotle or Plato or something abstract. You are talking about real individuals involved in a real kind of political moment. They have to make decisions based on the reality on the ground and the possible. That having been said, they understand that there are certain common characteristics of human beings that you have to take into account when thinking about how to form government. And so very little in the book doesn't begin with some account of human nature. What are human beings like? What motivates them to act the way that they act? Let's build a government not based on kind of pie in the sky ideals. Let's actually look at what human nature is, and let's try to shape our institutions so that they act accordingly. And This, of course, had been it was a sort of criticism of some of the philosophy of government that had preceded the Federalist. And so, as Madison says very famously in the 51st Federalist paper, what is government, but the greatest of all reflections on human nature. And so their understanding of the institution proceeds from that.
Talking with Dr. R.J. Pestritto. He's your teacher for the new Hillsdale College online course, The Federalist, available at hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE. The course emphasizes, too, that the Federalist is more than historical, as you alluded to earlier. It's politically instructive, and lessons are still relevant in today's political climate, certainly. You talked about earlier, what can the president do? What can the president not do? Is there instructive material here also, as this is a current question, what can the courts do and what can the courts not do?
Of course. It's actually, I think, very good reading to go back and to see what it is the Federalists, and particularly Alexander Hamilton, wrote the most famous paper, number 78, on the judiciary. What is the judicial power? Now, on the one hand, the Federalists were not shy in saying that we needed a robust national judiciary. They greatly feared that without it, the states would simply disregard the union, that the states would just sort of spin off from the center. And so they wanted a national judiciary with real teeth. That having been said, the judicial power itself, as they explained very clearly, is confined to individual cases and controversies. Right? That's the essence of what Article 3 is. It's the essence of what's explained in the Federalist. And this, just to give one example, this is highly relevant to us in thinking through the controversy that we have today over the so-called nationwide injunctions that are being handed down by judges. Does an individual judge have the power not just to resolve the dispute between particular parties in front of him or her, but to say, no, in addition to that, the government must or must not do thus and so for everybody in the country in all instances? Well, no reader of the Federalist could come away with that understanding of the judicial power. And that is front and center in terms of something that we can learn from reading the book that's very relevant to the crises of our time.
You mentioned Federalist that Hamilton wrote. Federalist 2 and 10 are also discussed in this course. Federalist 2 talks about the importance of our shared identity. Federalist 10 highlights the benefits of diverse opinions. How can both of those ideas, how can they best coexist in a healthy republic?
Yeah, so you've in breaking up those two papers, you've brought up the other two authors of the Federalist, number 2 written by John Jay, number 10 by Hamilton, and it's one of the interesting contrasts that I bring out to my students. On the one hand, in number 2, John Jay, Publius, is emphasizing what we have in common, and yet here we have in number 10, Madison is emphasizing what divides us, where we're different, what makes us diverse. And so we have to think through, well, how do we put these two things together? Well, what John Jay is emphasizing in number 2 is our shared history, our shared heritage, all of the ways in which God seems to have blessed us as a particular people. But in number 10, Madison is very clear. We have certain core common commitments. We have to have certain shared fundamental opinions about what just government is. We're not to be diverse on that question. But within that common core opinion, certainly we can have different interests, different opinions about policy, for example. And those are not only are they not problematic, but in fact they're healthy, because that competition of these different interests is what brings about genuine deliberation. It's what helps elevate reason over passion. It's what helps to make sure that one really kind of vocal and sort of nasty faction, that it doesn't get the upper hand. And so these two things go together: certain shared core heritage, history, core convictions about the rights of man, human nature, his right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but different interests with respect to the policies that government should undertake to achieve those principles. And so it's actually a great. Those two papers are great to consider together.
We're talking with Dr. R.J. Pestritto. He's your teacher for the new Hillsdale College online course, The Federalist. Let me take a moment to make sure you know where to find it. Again, hillsdale.edu/new course. That's NEWCOURSE. The Federalist is the best explanation of America's system of government, and it provides clear instructions on politics in general. The arguments teach us how to think about the purpose of government. They examine the realities of human nature and the structures of government that will best encourage virtue and discourage vice among the people and their representatives. We, all of us, have an unparalleled opportunity now to revive genuine Republican citizenship in America, but we must relearn to think through these fundamental political questions in front of us. You can make that happen by taking the new online course from Hillsdale College, The Federalist, with Dr. R.J. Pestritto. Sign up now, hillsdale.edu/new course. Take the course at your own pace. You will learn new things. You will be reminded of things you did learn long ago in grade school or high school, hopefully, and you can be a more engaged citizen, which we need here in our country. Hillsdale.edu/new course. Hillsdale.edu/new course for The Federalist with Dr. R.J. Pestritto. And we continue our conversation now about The Federalist, the new online course. Dr. Pestritto, we mentioned all three authors, as you mentioned now, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. Let's step back for just a moment, maybe take a minute or two and tell people, who were these guys? How did they come together in this project to write these Federalist papers?
Yeah, and principally we're talking about two, Hamilton and Madison. John Jay didn't contribute nearly as many. And they got together in New York City following the close of the Constitutional Convention in the fall of 1787. And they planned out a series of essays, much as you or I might write op-eds today in major newspapers. And so they had a plan for making the case for ratification, most immediately, most proximately there to affect the ratification debate in the state of New York, but of course very quickly sort of adopted throughout the states, all of the states at that time. And so even though Hamilton and Madison themselves were not identical in all of their views, we know that they had different views as Hamilton or as Madison. Those were kind of subordinated to this person of Publius, the name that they use, as the author of the Federalist, to talk about what the convention did. And they thought that what the convention did, even though, of course, it was the result of many compromises and much deliberation, but that there was something coherent there that could be explained and defended.
Talking with Dr. R.J. Pestritto, your teacher for the new Hillsdale online course, The Federalist, at hillsdale.edu/new course. How does this course help our students understand the balance between liberty and virtue in a self-governing society?
Well, I think this is really the great achievement of the Federalist, or it's the main balance that the authors are trying to persuade you of, right? The common assumption is, certainly during this debate, that you can either have in government, you can have liberty, and if you have lots of liberty, you're going to sacrifice other things, order in particular, stability, or if you favor order, then you're going to have to curtail liberty to a certain degree. And what the Federalists are suggesting is that they think they found a way to have some good degree of both of those things, and it's through the institutions of government. It's through their design of the institutions of government that we can empower government to do what it needs to do. And remember, this was a problem from the Federalist perspective in the 1780s. There wasn't enough centralized administration. There wasn't enough executive power. in government. And there was a real crisis in many of the state governments and in national government, such as it was in the 1780s. And so they were vigorous advocates of national power. This is something sometimes that many of us as conservatives are sort of like nails on a chalkboard to us. But it was necessary, but it had to be made safe for liberty. And well, how do you do that? Well, this power is channeled through a carefully crafted arrangement of institutions, which takes into account, to go back to a prior question you had, takes into account human nature. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about sacrificing one of these things for the sake of the other. It's about how do we ensure we can get both? Because after all, you need stability. You need a vigorous government in order to secure the liberty that you have by nature, not licensed by nature, not hey, you can go get whatever you want or do whatever you please. That's not the way they understood liberty. And so that's what they're trying to explain to you in the book, how it is that the Constitution achieves that.
Is there a particular insight or two that is shared inside this online course that might surprise someone who thinks that they already know how government is supposed to work?
I think the thing that often surprises, especially many more conservatively inclined folks about the Federalist, is how skeptical they are of state governments. Because it's certainly a thing for us today politically that anyone who's more conservatively inclined wants to devolve power away from the central government because of how powerful it's become, because of how just all-encompassing it has become. And so, those of us on the conservative side tend to emphasize state solutions, local solutions, state and local control, and as we should. That having been said, you're talking about a different set of circumstances that these individuals were facing. And for them, the states were not the solution. The states were the problem as they saw government in the 1780s. And we talk a little bit in the course about the history of what's going on in some of these states, the paper money crises, the kind of rampant kind of majority tyranny, the abuse of the rights of religious minorities, for example, the abuse of property rights. The states were, many of them anyways, were in very bad shape. And so I think a lot of contemporary readers, if they try to view it simply through the lens of ordinary kind of Republican, Democrat, kind of partisan politics, they say, whoa, these guys did not like the state governments. They did not want to devolve power to the state governments. And that can be surprising. Yeah. You have to put that in context, as I explained in the course, right? They're as much as they want to add some power nationally, they certainly would not have been advocates of the kind of national government that we find ourselves under today. But that is normally surprising to a lot of people.
Talking with Dr. R.J. Pestritto, your teacher for the new online course, The Federalist, at hillsdale.edu/new course. People who sign up to take this course many times want to be better citizens. What can the Federalist teach us about the role that everyday Americans can play in a return to self-government?
Well, it's absolutely essential. The assumption of the book is that republicanism cannot survive unless the citizens themselves understand what republicanism is, and understand that in a republic, after all, ultimately the government, the people are going to get their way. Sooner or later, the people are going to get their way, and so the people themselves have to be self-governing. The people themselves have to be vigilant about their liberty, and they have to understand that their liberty doesn't mean license. This isn't about the majority voting its will all the time to get whatever it wants for itself at the expense of the minority. That's government by faction. That's government by one part for the sake of that part. That's not the teaching of the Federalist. The teaching of the Federalist is, how do we get majority rule? Because after all, that's how the system works. But where that majority or that part governs for the whole or governs for the common good. And so the citizens have to understand that. They have to understand that there are limits to what even they can get for themselves when they are in the majority. And they have to be taught to respect forms. They have to respect the separation of powers. It's not the most efficient form of government you could think of, for example, certainly. So it is essential, and the Federalists understood that. And that's why the book was not only about winning the immediate debate. Mm-hmm. It was about that first and foremost, but it was not just about defeating the other side, but about persuading it and making common cause, because ultimately that's what would be required for long-term success.
Dr. R.J. Pestritto is Dean of Graduate School, Professor of Politics, and Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in the American Constitution here at Hillsdale College. He is also your teacher for the brand new Hillsdale College online course, The Federalist. You can sign up at hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE, hillsdale.edu/new course. Dr. Pestritto, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, Christopher J. Scalia joins us, his new book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program, plus all the Hillsdale College audio we have to offer. Podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Christopher J. Scalia. He's Senior Fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute, also a former English professor. And his brand new book is 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but Probably Haven't Read. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. Excited to talk to you.
Saw recently a story late last year about Columbia University students who were in class, and the professor was bemoaning the fact that they had never literally read a book, never assigned a book, never read something cover to cover, didn't know how to read books. Why is that a problem? What skills do we gain from reading novels, reading fiction?
It is really troubling. It is amazing how many people just don't read anything, and let alone fiction. But fiction is important to read, most basically because it is a great source of pleasure. It's fun to read great novels. Horace wrote long ago that great literature should instruct and delight. And so great novels delight us, and we learn things from them. We, as in other art forms, we learn about human nature. We learn about the complexities of human behavior, human feeling, and literature obviously does that. Novels do that through words and through narrative. And what we also find is that in novels, we develop particular abilities, and specifically we develop sympathetic abilities. In other words, we can relate to other people's feelings more substantially, more powerfully by reading fiction. And that doesn't mean everybody who reads a lot of fiction is a good person, but fiction is capable of doing that. And that seems especially important in a democracy where much of what we do is argue with each other, try to understand each other, and maybe occasionally come to some sort of compromise as we try to govern ourselves. And I think in this day and age, we think that many people think that the only kind of way of knowing, the only legitimate way of knowing is like nonfiction or data or numbers or facts. But fiction is another way of knowing about the world. It provides another way of understanding how people think and exploring other people's consciousness. And yes, it's true that the events did not literally happen, but great fiction is plausible, and it works because it brings us into the minds of how people actually do think, even if these specific people did not exist.
So what's a conservative book or a conservative novel? How do you gauge whether or not conservatives might like these books you're suggesting in 13 novels conservatives will love?
Yeah, I refrained from calling these conservative novels because I didn't want to reduce them to that. But these novels are, first of all, they're all great works of literature that I think anybody, regardless of politics, would enjoy. But what they all do is present some idea or principle or value that conservatives tend to think about a lot or to uphold or just believe in. And not all of every novel, I try to focus on a different such belief. So in the first work I look at, it's a 1759 work by Samuel Johnson called Rasselas. And in that one, I focus on that book's depiction of an enduring human nature. That is, that there are some passions, reactions, types of behaviors that transcend time and place. And that's really a fundamental conservative value that has a lot of implications that I tease out over the course of the book. And then other novels look at the dangers of utopian thinking and the futility of utopian thinking. Specifically, the Nathaniel Hawthorne novel, The Blithedale Romance, looks at that. It's kind of a not quite a satire, but a critique of this failed agrarian commune that is in part based on Hawthorne's own experience. So I try to touch on different conservative values. You're not going to read this book and suddenly come away with great policy ideas. This isn't a series of policy prescriptions, but it's kind of the habits of thought that tend to be common among conservatives. And I should say, certainly not all of them. This isn't a completely all-encompassing depiction of conservative thought, but it covers a lot of the most important bases.
You also say you're focusing on literary fiction in this book and in the list. What does that mean is here and what's not here?
Literary fiction, yeah, again, that's a very snobby way of putting it, I guess. But as opposed to, say, genre fiction like detective fiction or horror or sci-fi, which I don't think are bad, but literary fiction tends to emphasize character development, character psychology, and quality of prose. So these are, I guess you could say these novels would be more likely to be taught in literature classes. Though I think a lot of these books are not often taught in literature classes. They could be. But there are exceptions. So I have a dystopian novel in here, The Children of Men by P.D. James from 1992. And it has very interesting characters, but it's set in kind of, it was written in 1992, set in 2021, a world where humans have stopped being able to reproduce. And it's kind of a 1984 or Brave New World, a kind of dystopian novel that Hillsdale's own John J. Miller has written about well for National Review. Most of the other novels I write about here are, what you would call literary fiction. Another example that I include is Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, which is it's a very long novel, but it has George Eliot was just especially good at probing the consciousness of her characters and explaining what they're thinking at given times, what decisions, why they make the terrible decisions they make over the course of the novel, and details like that, which really help us understand human nature, are not always quite so evident in forms of genre fiction. I will say one last point there. P.D. James, author of Children of Men, often wrote, most of the books she wrote were mystery novels. So she did often write other genre fiction. And she said that fiction was particularly conservative because crime fiction always moves from disorder to order. And P.D. James was herself a conservative member of parliament, actually.
Christopher Scalia with us. His book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but Probably Haven't Read. You discuss in the introduction the decline in the percentage of people reading novels, and also the cocktail party test. What would you be embarrassed not to have read if something comes up at a cocktail party? I'm wondering if those things are somewhat connected, meaning are people reading fewer novels because they're less concerned of failing the cocktail party test, that people aren't reading similar things, there's no need to discuss similar things, and it goes back to a fractured media environment. But that thought that you won't have to discuss something like a recent novel, a great novel, because not everyone is reading the same thing.
There's certainly less peer pressure about it, yeah, because people are reading less in general. The example that term is from, I quote a book by Joseph Bottom, but he's in turn quoting Andy Ferguson, my friend and colleague here at AEI. And Andy said that the last book he can think of that had that cocktail party status was The Bonfire of the Vanities, which was 1987. And I think you could make the case that there have been more recent novels, but I think the point is, I think it holds true. And I don't know how to stop that. I don't know how to address that in large part because, as you're suggesting, there are so many forms of so many other media that compete with novels for our attention. There are podcasts, for example, but there's social media, and there are streaming services and everything like that. It used to be there was, when you and I were growing up, there was basically just television and maybe video games. Now there's a lot more television, and video games are 100 times more sophisticated than they were. And so I think a return to reading novels takes a real effort. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is to kind of remind people, especially into your introduction, remind people why it's valuable in the first place, and then kind of give them a springboard of where they can start and help them think about what they should be getting from these novels.
Let's talk about a few of the suggestions inside 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love. Willa Cather's book, My Antonia. I did a series of conversations with Dr. Chris Bush from here at Hillsdale College on Willa Cather, who he loves, obviously, and he thinks My Antonia is the masterpiece from Willa Cather's collection of books. What makes that novel so good, and why is Willa Cather perhaps overlooked among American fiction fans?
Well, I'll start with the second question. She's overlooked because so many of her peers, or the generation of writers right after her, were undeniably great, like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and that generation, undeniably great, but also a lot flashier, and formally maybe more innovative. Cather is formally kind of conservative, and she didn't write about fashionable life, big city life, especially in her best novels anyway. And I think that's one reason she's been overlooked. My Antonia is a beautiful novel because Cather's writing captures the landscape of the Nebraska plains so evocatively, so beautifully, and her characters are vivid and, for the most part, I would say, likable. I think what's arguably conservative about this novel is what I argue in my book, is that it is just a marvelous depiction of the American dream for immigrants and for native-born Americans alike. It's set in the late 19th century, I think right after Nebraska has become a state, and the narrator is looking back on his life growing up in Nebraska. He had been orphaned when he was young. He moved from Virginia to Nebraska to start a life there. And in Nebraska, he meets a lot of immigrants, and the main one is the title character, Antonia. And Antonia has a difficult time of it, and the novel makes clear that not all immigrants succeed, even those who do succeed do not succeed easily. But Antonia and many of her peers end up having wonderful, wonderful lives in the United States. A couple of her friends do so by finding careers, but Antonia finds happiness living on a farm and starting a huge family. Meanwhile, the narrator, a man named Jim Burden, again, not an immigrant, but he is also this emblem of the American dream in that he overcomes his difficult childhood and has great academic success and then great success as a businessman. And the novel makes clear he is successful as a businessman working for the railways in large part because he loves the country so much. He loves the land that he's helping shape and helping form. And Scott, you may be especially interested to know that in that chapter, I discuss the Pretenders song,
yes.
My City Was Gone, and particularly in the context of the Rush Limbaugh show.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask about that. Perhaps just briefly, this idea of creative destruction and what it means to different people. You can look at something and say, it's great that there's something new. It's great we're moving forward. And at the same time, and I think, it's a theme in some of Cather's work, this feeling of nostalgia or loss because things are changing. Even on the right, among conservatives, there's a bit of push and pull on that topic.
Yeah, it is really a difficult balance. And I know that I feel that myself. I live in the town where I grew up, and some of the changes I see make me cringe, and then others seem not like drastic changes, but more like developments. Mm-hmm. And in the case of My Antonia, Jim Burden returns to the town in which he grew up, and he sees the changes, but they do not make him cringe because they feel natural. They feel like natural outgrowths. The homes and the farms and the way they've developed seemed like he could recognize the landscape he knew before. They weren't totally, destroyed beyond recognition. So that is a constructive kind of change. And this is something all conservatives need to deal with. This goes way back to Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, which I discuss a few times in this book. And one of his points is a government needs to change. A government that cannot change will die. And I think you have to take that more broadly. A society that can't change is doomed. Mm-hmm. So a culture and a society need to change, but conservatives want that change, prefer that change to be gradual and when possible, I think from the ground up. And I think in My Antonia, Cather, or at least this narrator, are suggesting that's what's happening in the Nebraska he's describing.
Christopher Scalia with us, his book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love But Probably Haven't Read. Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God. Hurston's work, in a lot of ways, challenges some of the stereotypes or the conventional wisdom about the African-American experience at that time. What makes her writing different and worth seeking out?
It's funny when I talk to people about Hurston, people over 50 have never heard of this novel. People under 40.
I think I had to read it for school, Chris.
Yeah. People under 40 maybe under 50 are much more familiar with it. And that's because Hurston, when she died in 1960, died in obscurity and poverty. And her reputation was resuscitated in the late 1970s, in large part by the novelist Alice Walker. And her reputation early on in this revival was as a Black feminist. And this novel in particular was a Black feminist novel. And that's really an oversimplification of this work. I think that there are certainly feminist elements, but Their Eyes Were Watching God is about a young woman who enters into an arranged marriage when she's very young, and it's not a happy marriage. And she enters into another marriage, which is slightly less unhappy, but still not very good. And that marriage lasts for 20 years. And then she marries finally a much younger man. That is her happiest marriage. But again, he's not an ideal husband. In other words, it's a novel about this woman's understanding of herself and of marriage and happiness, how to find happiness within a marriage. And a lot of what she discovers, or at least some of what she discovers, challenges, I think, feminist understandings of marriage. And for example, in her first marriage, she wants to work. She wants to stay in the home and work. And one of the reasons she's unhappy is that her husband does not want her there. His husband wants her out of the house. It's a little bit topsy-turvy and kind of defies stereotypes. But then as far as relations between the races go, there are some passages. Hurston does this really interesting thing where she has early in the novel, her grandmother tells Janie that a black woman is the mule of the world. That is, everybody mistreats a black woman. And then later in the novel, black characters say that black men have it worse than anybody, but white men and black women have it best of all. So are these conflicting understandings of how race works in the United States. That's just one example. There are many over the course of the work, but I think what's one of my favorite passages is a conversation Janie has with a neighbor about Booker T. Washington. And this neighbor is a terrible woman. And she's the most racist person. She's a light-skinned black woman who hates dark-skinned black people, and is just a real bigot against them. And she also hates Booker T. Washington. And the implication is Booker T. Washington can't be so bad if this woman hates him. And so in that way, Hurston, who did actually love Booker T. Washington, is subtly or not so subtly endorsing Washington's message of self-reliance and education over political agitation as a means to progress and upward mobility for blacks in the United States. And that put her at odds with a lot of her contemporaries. Early reviews for this novel were pretty brutal. Mm-hmm. People like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, basically, they didn't use the term Uncle Tom, but they basically called her an Uncle Tom, saying that she basically wrote black people that white people would like. And her reputation is so different now. She was a conservative person. She was a patriot, and she hated communism, just two examples. And as I said, she kind of espoused Booker T. Washington's beliefs. So I think conservatives might see how this novel has kind of come from out of nowhere to be on every curriculum and be skeptical about it. But in fact, I think conservatives will find a lot to love about this novel.
Finally, Chris Scalia's book, 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read. I tried to look for one that I was unfamiliar with, that looked interesting, and I landed on Leif Enger's Peace Like a River. So take 60 seconds, convince me and listeners why this should be the next book we read.
This is a great novel published in 2001. That's kind of a combination of a neo-Western, involves a road trip where family tries to rescue a son who's a fugitive from the law. They try to get to him before the feds do. But it's also about the reality of miracles in everyday life. The narrator is a child when the events occur, and he's convinced that his father can perform miracles. So it's a wonderful novel about Christian belief that is also just some great old-fashioned storytelling with memorable characters, including the narrator's sister, and a terribly evil character who appears towards the end of the novel. Not many people have read this novel, but everybody I know who's read it love it.
All right, that's a good sell job. The book is 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, but probably haven't read. The author, Christopher J. Scalia. He's Senior Fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute. Chris, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
You're welcome, Scott. Thank you for having me.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. R.J. Pestritto. He's your teacher for the new Hillsdale online course, The Federalist, at hillsdale.edu/new course, and Christopher J. Scalia. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.